Welcome to another episode of Palestine, an organic story. Today's episode is with Daniel Seaman. He is from Israel. And before I start this interview, I want to post a disclaimer that none of these opinions are expressed by me, whatever Daniel is saying. And I don't necessarily support all the opinions expressed here. And to some people, they might be disturbing. But from a journalistic point of view, I thought that it would be interesting to also know the Israeli point of view, how they are feeling about the entire situation, and how they would actually defend everything that's been going on in Palestine. So I will repeat myself. Some views expressed here by the Israeli representative Daniel Seaman. They might be disturbing, they might not make sense, but it is what it is. And I myself had to maintain a calm composure while speaking to him. I tried my best to get as much explanation and defense I could get out of him as a representative of the majority Israeli community, as he claims himself to be. And the opinions he has expressed, they might not resonate with us, with everybody else. So I'll begin my interview with Daniel Seaman joining me from Israel. And he has been a government official for almost 30 years now. And now he is an analyst. He works as an analyst on different TV channels, local and international. And through the help of my friend, Abby, I could get him to speak to me on this interview. So let's begin. Hi, Daniel Seaman. Thank you so much for joining me for this talk.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So Daniel, you're currently residing in Jerusalem or Al-Quds, right?
Jerusalem. Yes.
Jerusalem. So please tell me what's going on over there. What is your eyewitness account of what's happening there?
Well, here in Jerusalem, it's relatively quiet after the situation erupted about a week ago during the Islamic holidays. Things here have been relatively quiet. When I say here, people don't always realize that you mentioned Al-Quds. Al-Quds is the Arab name for the city. And there is a more or less divide between the Arab areas and the Jewish areas. But life on the day-to-day here is very much a mixture of Jews and Arabs living together. So we do have Arabs in our neighborhood who work here, who own businesses here on our side that they were closed last week because of the Islamic holiday. So we work with them. We have our doctors. My children's dentist is East Jerusalem Arab. So there is interaction between us. And despite things are a bit tense and unpleasant, most people try to get along and go through their day-to-day lives. Living together here, it works for the benefit of all of us. So altogether, despite everything that's going on in the country, and things in the country right now, moments before you contacted me, I got a message from my sister. They live in the town of Ashkelon, which is just north of the Gaza Strip. And there they came under a missile barrage. And I just quickly checked to see if they're all okay. So this is happening throughout Israel right now, and a lot of tensions going on between Arab citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens. So compared to that, here in Jerusalem, we really have a very good situation right now. So
relatively stable, you would say.
Excuse me?
Relatively stable, right?
Yes, yes. As best, not as pleasant and as good as it is in the past, because there is the atmosphere, which is unpleasant, but all in all, Jerusalemites, both Jewish and Arab, prefer to live together, I guess. It's much more pleasant that way.
Daniel, you mentioned that Jews and Arabs are living together in the city of Jerusalem. But what is the situation of the apartheid over there, especially in the city of Hebron, where there are multiple police checkpoints, as I heard?
Well, you use the term apartheid, which has connotations which are not applicable to the situation here. Here there's a conflict, a war going on. Some can call it political. Basically, it's a religious war between Islam and the Jews. And this situation erupted several times with the creation of Israel in 48 and the Six-Day War in 73, and then tensions which erupted here and there over the years. Almost 30 years ago, there were attempts to resolve the situation peacefully. These had different levels of success. But there are two situations we're talking about. One is inside the situation in the state of Israel, where the term apartheid is not applicable at all. And I think it diminishes the concept of what happened to the blacks in Africa at the time, because it takes away, because anybody coming here and witnessing for themselves what is going on, they then ask, what is the whole issue of apartheid? Here in Israel, you have ethnic and religious tensions, but all in all, Arab citizens who make up 20% of the state of Israel are full citizens. They enjoy all the benefits and all the rights and roam around freely. They have their own media. They work in jobs together with Israel. I had colleagues when I worked for government. I worked for 30 years in government. I had colleagues who were Israeli Arab citizens. Some of them serve in the army. I have a good friend who served in a combat unit who's an Israeli Arab. So you have police officers, judges, I can go on, but I think you get the point. Here in Israel, that's the situation. Jews and Arabs live together with all the differences, with all the points of tension. Israel has been successful in maintaining the democratic principles of this country and allocate rights to all citizens of the country. On the other hand, in Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza Strip, there is a different situation. It started almost 50 some years ago in 1967, when Israel was attacked by the Arab countries and by Muslim countries, because in the war against Israel at that time, Muslim countries who were not engaged directly and with borders with Israel joined in on the attack on Israel. They lost the war. Israel in that war was able to take over these territories that are behind what is called the Green Line. These are areas that were historically the areas of the Jewish kingdom. My family came to Israel from Afghanistan nearly 100 years ago. My grandfather came here to places called Hebron and Bethlehem and Shiloh and Shechem, which you call Nablus. These are places that meant to the Jewish people were our heritage. So for political reasons, not to get into those political reasons, there was the debates, there was the historical conflict. But in 1967, Israel took control of these areas. We did not annex these territories into Israel, but we're hoping to have it resolved in a peaceful way. In 1993, the Israeli government at that time, together with the PLO, which for us was a terrorist organization, reached an agreement. And we allowed Yasser Arafat and the PLO into these territories to set up an autonomy and an autonomous rule with the hopes that eventually would be turned over to the control of the Palestinians. It did not work out for many reasons. We later tried, we've been told over the years, if we just left these areas, we would suddenly have peace would erupt very miraculously. Well, we did leave the Gaza Strip. It's almost 15 years since Israel left the Gaza Strip. We pulled out every single Israeli citizen, including the dead peoples. We uprooted the cemeteries. So there's not a single living Jew or dead Jew in the Gaza Strip today. And yet, despite this, that area has been used, instead of helping the Palestinian people, has been used to promote attacks against the state of Israel. And basically, the round of violence we have at the moment is erupted from there. So in those areas, there is an Israeli occupation. Basically, the Arabs are free in about 43% of the areas. They're under their own control. Areas where there are Jewish people, there is obviously Israeli control and Israeli military. Hebron, for example, is divided. There is a Jewish sector, which Arabs have access to because of the location of the Tomb of the Patriarchs.
But what about all the harassment that the Arabs have to face over there, the checkpoints? You say that they're free to roam about there, but I also read and I also heard from personal experiences that, okay, let's not call it apartheid, let's call it curtailing freedom of the citizens of Palestine, Israel, trying to coexist. And they're harassed at the police checkpoints, and when the curfew hits, they have to like cross over through the rooftops to actually get from one side to the other. How would you describe this situation?
As unpleasant, as one which is unfortunate reflection of the realities here. It's not New York City. It's not Paris or London or any place in the Western world I don't know what's going on in Pakistan, for example, but when you have a conflict, a place where two peoples are at odds and at war, you have unfortunate situations which are a reflection of those tensions. And here Israel has control over these areas, and at times there are those people who try to abuse the freedoms that are given and attack our side. You do not, to the most extent, you do not have attacks by Jews against the Arabs. These attacks are from their area for whatever reasons. We don't need to get into the moment. It's a fact that we have to defend ourselves against. The reaction that we have
Daniel,
to this at times is unfortunate for the Palestinians who live there. That's clear. But we don't have much of a choice.
You speak about defending yourself, and I believe that the curfews and the police checkposts are there to defend yourselves, right? To defend Israelis from the Arabs living there, right? Again, so my question is, there is a clear imbalance of power between Palestine and Israel. Israel receives around 3.8 billion trillion funding from USA, right? And Palestinians have just stones, rocks, or just some plastic bottles or glass bottles to throw at the Israeli special military. And recently we saw that the Al-Aqsa Mosque was raided during the holy month of Ramzan. How do you say that that Israeli people were defending themselves from unarmed Palestinian Arabs who were also peacefully worshiping in the mosque?
You're Muslim, I assume.
Of course.
Okay. I asked that very simply because then you would be familiar with the Muslim faith. Is there anything in the Muslim faith that allows you to throw rocks at people praying in a different location who are not Muslim? Is there anything in your religious holiday last month that this was part of the custom of assaulting non-Muslims? I'm being very facetious when asking
in any
this,
religion. In any religion, this is not supported.
That is not acceptable. But this is what the Jews in the old city of Jerusalem faced. And if this is how they practice their religion, then you can understand that we have not a responsibility, we have a complete right to defend ourselves. It wasn't that we assaulted them. Now, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount is under Israeli control for over 50 years now. It erupts at times in violence. We allow full prayer, and by the way, the area itself is controlled by the Jordanian Waqf. We gave them the religious right to, despite the fact that we occupy that area and we are in control of that area, we worked with the religious authorities in Jordan to allow them the control over it. But at times they cannot curtail the violent element among the Arabs, and it's unfortunate, but this is the reality and the truth. And they try to assault the Jews. The simple thing is, as long as their violence does not erupt, there is no Israeli reaction, and we cannot allow that violence. Now, you also mentioned the fact that they're poor and helpless. The poor and helpless Palestinians, as you say it, doesn't fit with the reality of what is going on right now. There are missiles being fired at every place in Israel. As I mentioned before, my family is in the city of Ashkelon. They have been under assault for the past week with over 1,000 missiles on that city alone. This does not make for a helpless people. This makes for a terrorist organization, Hamas, who is trying to do everything to undermine the state of Israel and defeat the state of Israel. We know that, and the realities that we faced over generations of being under Islamic control, and it's enough for us to see what happens with the Yazidi in Iraq, the Christians around the Muslim world. Anybody who is incapable of defending themselves become the victims of extreme Islam. This is not going to happen inside the state of Israel. I'm sorry. There's no way I can make this, beautify it. There's no way except saying that the choice for us between getting a nice picture and having a pleasant interview with you, though you're very pleasant about it, and you're raising these very uncomfortable realities, for me to be able to receive your praise would basically be us not having a state of Israel. And we know what the consequences of that is. So that reality requires of us to do things that, believe me, I have a son who's 18 years old, who enlisted in the army as a paratrooper.
Can I interrupt you? I'm sorry,
I would be very happy not to have him in the military.
Can I interrupt you? You said that there are consequences to not having a state of Israel. Can you please elaborate on that?
Well, if there wasn't a state of Israel, and here the Jewish state, the Jewish people for 2,000 years, and we were expelled here by the Romans back in the year 72 to the Christian era. This is historical fact. People don't believe it. You can go to Rome and you see the shrine of Titus, who expelled the Jews from here, and we were in a 2,000-year exile. Over these years, during these years, Jews lived in Europe, Jews lived in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, as I said before.
Yeah.
My family actually came from the Babylonian exile, lived in Persia, and then moved to Afghanistan. We can trace our roots back to the tribe of Benjamin. So about 120 years ago, Jews who were always told and were never accepted as full free citizens and equal citizens anywhere, were always told to go back to the land of Israel, to Palestine, as the Romans called it. We finally did that, and we exercised our right to self-determination. This was not accepted. The international community accepted this. This was not accepted, by the way, which is the right of the Muslim and Arab countries did not accept this. They have a right not to accept it. What they did not have a right to do was to use force and try to eliminate the Jewish presence here. They lost in that war. It's a simple fact of reality. And that's where the conflict, which began over 100 years ago, continues to this day.
Okay, Daniel, so I've listened to you very carefully. Thank you for giving me your side of the story. But there are a couple of things that I disagree with you, if we can talk about that. You use the word occupy. You say that Israel has occupied lands of Palestine. You said that there are violent elements in the Arabs living there. You said that these elements lead to extreme Islamic values, and also that Israelis have the right to exercise self-determination. You said all these things. So my fair question to you is going to be the violation of human rights being done over there by the Israeli forces. We all know you guys have the top-notch military equipment. You have the best guided missiles. You have the best, thwarting technology. You can thwart all kinds of missiles. So when you say you guys were, Israelis were hit by 1,000 missiles, I'm pretty sure you guys have the capacity to thwart them all. I don't think Hamas has that capability. I'm being neutral in the fact that Israel has a very good army technology, right? Israel has so far targeted refugee camps with children in them. And just now, so far, 10 people have been killed over there. 10 Palestinian refugees have been killed, and that included 8 children. Their homes have been destroyed. And in Gaza Strip, if we talk about the Gaza Strip alone, the main road that leads to the Shifa hospital, that is the largest hospital in that area, that road has been destroyed. So if the Arabs living there need to get to healthcare, they cannot. You said that Israelis left the Gaza Strip. They don't live there anymore, but you're also kind of destroying their health system that they need at this point. And in Gaza Strip, again, 150 Palestinians have been killed, and that includes 41 children. And on the occupied West Bank, and occupied is the word that you also used, 13 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces and 450 wounded, while 100 of them have been injured through live ammunition. So when you talked about the violent elements, the extremist religious elements, and the right to exercise self-determination, where do you fit all these elements in the things I've just said?
Well, when you present it in such a way that it absolves the Palestinians of all responsibility for any of their actions. The fact that they are under Israeli occupation does not automatically equal them to render them helpless and defenseless. You mentioned before the money, the aid that Israel gets from the United States. Yes, we do. But at the same time, you have almost more than double that of aid coming from Arab countries and European countries to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to help them create and build a nation there after Israel had left. When I speak about the extreme element, the Hamas took over control of the Gaza Strip by force. And they expelled the Palestinian Authority. And they've used that aid and that money coming in there to build defenses and military installations and place them deliberately in civilian areas, knowing very well, by the way, which that in and of itself is a war crime under international law. And they take refuge behind the civilians, knowing two things. First, that Israel would be very careful and cautious at not retaliating. And at the other time, putting them that if Israel does, you'll have the same question with you, who are definitely an honorable person and a caring person, and many people like you see this, and it tears your heart apart. I understand that. It is not pleasant for me to stand here and hear a decent person like yourself say that to me, because you see these things. They're horrible. But this is also, you cannot absolve Palestinians of responsibility for what is going on. We cannot be more responsible for their civilians than they are themselves. No country in the world. The first responsibility for the government of Pakistan is the Pakistani people. The government of Pakistan cannot be responsible for the Indian people, for example. If India was attacking Pakistan right now, you would want them to wipe out India as quickly as possible so that your lives aren't endangered. We are very careful. We do two things. We inform them first. We identify clearly the military installations. We inform the civilians in the area, which also means that those military personnel can escape before destroying these bases. Now, the money that came in over just the past few years was used to build an underground system. They even called it, the Arabs themselves, the Hamas themselves, called it the metro system. An underground system of tunnels that they would use in defense against Israel if we ever had to invade the Gaza Strip again. That happened this week. But instead, we used the international media, told them that we're invading the Gaza Strip. Hamas immediately took shelter in these tunnels, and by doing so, they exposed the entrances to Israel, and we used this to demolish those tunnels with the Hamas fighters inside. What happened was that this metro, which is underground, all of the Gaza, and then near the Shifa hospital, it collapsed. And that's what created the building of those underground military installations in order to attack Israel came to the detriment of the Palestinian people. Now, I'm very sorry for that. And it's unfortunate for the Palestinians, but they, and you yourselves, have to turn the finger to the Palestinians and say, when do they take responsibility for themselves? They can't continue and always say that they're the victims. Pakistanis who are at war with India do not stand around all the day saying that they're victims. They expect their government to treat them, to use any money they have for the benefit of the Pakistani people. Unfortunately, the Hamas do not care about that. They'd rather create the situation where international pressure is applied to Israel because, as you mentioned, we have one of the, and I'm not ashamed of this, we have one of the most sophisticated, strongest militaries in the world, and it's been made so because we have no other choice. It has become a reality that we have to face, that we need that. So those circumstances, when they know that, they know what the consequences of picking a fight with Israel is going to be. So who is more irresponsible to the population there? We, or our responsibility for the protection of our population, or they who do not care, apparently, enough for their own people?
I understand the right to protect yourself, and the perspective changes from which side of the road you're standing. So I understand where you are coming from, but you mentioned the escalation of tensions between India and Pakistan. Well, India and Pakistan have been at war ever since the independence in 1947, but Pakistan has never used violence against India. You can actually look at the news recently. Every time they attacked,
I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah, but this example actually doesn't apply to the situation over there right now, because Pakistan has always, especially in the recent past, has always adopted a road for peace and negotiations. And we just recently succeeded in getting another ceasefire done at the LOC, the disputed border, and we always promote peace. So that's a different situation.
You can understand Israel that way if you're very similar to the Israeli side then.
Right, but unfortunately, that's not how it's being reported to us, because the facts and figures, the balance, it doesn't really stay like this. It has to be like on one side. It's heavier on one side, and that has to be on the Israeli side.
That is not an indication of anybody being right or wrong. It just means that one side has greater capabilities, just like the Allied forces had in World War II. There were more German and Japanese casualties than there were in the Western world. That does not make them right.
Okay. And you said that Israel is actually very careful in, attacking civilian areas and all, but actually Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted that he will not stop, and the attacks will keep on going, and anybody who thinks that they're going to, calm down, the Israeli missiles are going to calm down, they're not going to calm down. And he just recently posted a lot of flags, and he was thanking all those countries for their support. So a lot of countries are supporting Israel. And the top of the list is USA. Like, they just delayed the recent UN Security Council session and they have the power to use veto, right? China and Russia are pushing for that session to happen so it can, be settled with negotiations. But I guess Netanyahu has some other plans, and US is clearly backing it, or so it seems, right? So this also, I don't really understand the entire concept of it. And you said that majority of the Arab countries are not standing with Israel. Well, Daniel, you know that recently a lot of Arab countries have recognized Israel as an independent state, right? UAE being the recent one. Even Saudi Arabia, in fact, we heard the news that they've met with the Israeli counterparts. And you said
By
that
the way, there's
European
also talk
countries,
about Pakistan. There's
okay,
also been talk about Pakistan being one of those countries.
but Pakistan is not really on board right now to accept Israel, but we'll see where that camel sits. And then you talked about the European countries also supporting Palestine. Well, when the
Financially.
Palestinian diaspora started to protest in France, they actually had to disperse the protesters using water cannons. So I feel that the violation of human rights over there, and the kind of defense that Israel is giving is not really matching up.
You mentioned a lot of points. I want to clarify one thing. Netanyahu is the democratically elected leader of the state of Israel and is doing what the Israeli people want. And I can tell you very clearly, no, we do not want a ceasefire with Hamas right now. They're the ones who started this. It's been going on, by the way. You just hear about it now when it flares up to something that becomes, or basically when Israel responds. For 20 years now, they've been firing indiscriminately missiles at Israeli civilian targets. My family, as I mentioned before, in Gaza, have gone through this in the past year 3 times alone. It never met the media because it wasn't large scale. I'm not going to be apologetic of any of this. They've risen and they've tried to, for whatever reasons, by the way, there's a whole political issue at play here, internal Palestinian issue. There were supposed to be elections. The Palestinian Authority understood that Hamas may very likely win the elections in the Judea and Samaria and the Arab towns and villages in that area, and therefore he canceled the elections. And Hamas is now trying to respond. Instead of fighting amongst themselves, they decided to draw Israel into this. And I don't think anybody would tolerate it, and anybody who says they would has never been in the situation we are at the moment. So I'm not going to apologize about us defending ourselves, and I'm not going to apologize of us not wanting to a ceasefire. They should not have picked the fight. You, who are not involved here, an intelligent young woman, has mentioned exactly what the strength of Israel is. You have that intelligence to understand that. You want to tell me there's not a single person in the Palestinian regime or in the Hamas that don't understand it? They know exactly what they're getting into. And yet they chose this fight, hoping that the international community would prevent Israel from doing this. But the international community is not supporting Israel because they hate the Palestinians or they're against justice or because of supposed human rights violations going on in the state of Israel. There are human violations going on right now with the Russia in places, with the Chinese against Muslim minority in China. Nobody's saying a word about it. It was not even raised in the United Nations. The only reason the United States supported Israel right now and voted against this is because of the fact that Israel is in a fight of self-defense, which is recognized by the international community as a basic right. And right now, our goal is to totally obliterate the Hamas and make it that they no longer want to pick a fight with us. The Palestinian people and people like yourselves and people who care sincerely and deeply for the Palestinians should be saying right now to the Hamas themselves, put down your weapons, stop firing missiles at the state of Israel. Israel won't do it. Now, you mentioned we have this army. You mentioned all the power that we had. Why haven't we gone in? Why haven't we taken it over? We can wipe them out within hours. We don't want to. We don't want to occupy the Palestinians in Gaza. Situation in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank as you call it, is a bit more complex, but we are looking for a resolution to that as well. Part of what Netanyahu is doing, the relations we're developing with the Arab world today, was deliberately for that. The Palestinian issue has become not only a force to undermine the state of Israel, it's undermining the Arab world. There's so much that Jews and Arabs can do here. We can be a power much greater, economically I'm talking about, Jews and Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East and in Asia, much greater than Europe itself. if we put our minds together and we have benefits, both sides have benefits that we can join together, be a major economic force. That's what Netanyahu is trying to create here. Hamas, extreme Islam, does not want that to happen. And that's what they're trying to undermine today. So yes, we're going to fight Hamas until their bitter end, unfortunately for them.
Okay, Daniel, okay, two questions, actually three arise from here. You used the term that the international community probably hates the Palestinians. That's why they're not standing up for Palestinians.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say hate, not at all.
Okay.
No, they understand that Israel, look, I want to separate between Palestinian people and their cause and the Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization which have abducted
I get
the
that.
Palestinian
And is killing children and attacking refugee camps a justified answer to Hamas's attacks?
No, not at all, but it's an unfortunate consequence. And I just want to make one point that a Palestinian children's right organization in Gaza issued a statement last week that a number of children who were killed were eventually actually killed by Hamas missiles that fell. They're very inaccurate. About 20% of the missiles launched in the direction of Israel fall into the Gaza Strip itself. And these children were killed by a Hamas missile. Again, stressing the fact that Hamas is causing more damage, more pain, and more tragedy to the Palestinians than anything Israel can even do.
Okay, and Israel also maintains a no-go buffer zone within the territory of Gaza. Is that correct?
No, it no longer exists. There's not a buffer zone there. They can even reach, and they've tried to reach the fence that we have up there to try to penetrate to Israel. But there was a buffer zone in the past. It doesn't exist right now.
When did they take it down?
I don't want to say exact, don't take me at exactly, because this is something that we haven't invested a lot of thought in. I think it was about 10 years ago. There was a buffer, I think over a kilometer wide buffer to not allow them to get near the border to penetrate Israel, because we have Jewish communities along the border with Gaza there. And unfortunately, they don't come across with flowers and singing, let's all live together in peace and kumbaya, my Lord. They're there to try to attack these settlements. So we found areas, we have electronics that are capable of seeing anybody trying to penetrate. So we allow the Palestinian farmers in Gaza now to work their fields up into the border, as long as we can see that they are indeed farmers and not armed terrorists.
Okay, Daniel, so on behalf of the Jewish community living in Israel, do you perceive Palestinian Arabs a different community as the Hamas people?
I'll put it this way, no, because they chose them and they voted for them. In Gaza Strip, Hamas, as I mentioned, took over violently and ousted the PLO.
May I interrupt, please?
But in general, they're the leaders. But I do separate between the Palestinian Authority, who we are in negotiations with for nearly 30 years now, and Hamas, who are a terrorist organization.
So if you don't view Palestinian Arabs and Hamas people as two different entities, then why are you hopeful that you and the Palestinian Arabs can coexist and be a bigger power economically speaking?
Because I see the way things are in the state of Israel. As I mentioned before, after the 48 war, there were what the Muslims call the 48 Palestinians. They're about 28% of our population who remained here, who live in Israeli cities such as Tel Aviv, Jaffa, in Haifa, in Tiberias, in Beersheba, in Lod, in Ramle, in places that they've been able to live together now for 73 years. And we have a very successful coexistence. There are those extremists on all sides who are not pleased about it, religious extremists, but it doesn't change the fact that on day to day, Jewish children in Jerusalem, my kids go and have been to places where Jewish and Arab kids go to school together. So there is a lot of coexistence. Certainly because of the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, there are tensions here. But altogether, when people in the international community speak about multiracial societies, etc., Israel is that. We have Jews, Christians, Muslims, people from all over the world, Jews from all over living here harmoniously most of the time. And it proves that you can get along together. As I said, they work in government. We have Supreme Court judges. I can go on and on, but you get the picture. Israel, high-tech ability, one of the things we were very optimistic about in the signing with the agreements now with the Gulf states was that this relationship with them will open up tremendous job opportunities for the Israeli Arabs because of the language and because of the cultural differences that they don't share because of the same Islamic culture. So these things they would serve as a bridge between the Jews in the state of Israel and the Arab countries here. And together we would be able to, look, the state of Israel has gone from a third world country, and I came here from the United States, as you can tell from my accent, 50 years ago, and Israel was a backward third world country at that time. And in the 50 years that I've lived here, not because of me, but in the 50 years that I've lived here, Israel has transformed itself into being one of the strongest economies and one of the leading countries in the world economically. We're more than happy to share that knowledge and that ability with our neighbors and with our friends, just as the Arabs in Israel, the Palestinians in Israel, are part of our economy here. So that's why we're optimistic about it, and that is what the goal of Netanyahu has been.
Okay, so you spoke about the similarity in languages, and I also believe that for two different religious communities or ethnically different communities, if they have to coexist, then language is that one thing that can bridge the gap. So do the Jews over there speak Arabic, or the Palestinian Arabs speak Hebrew, or all of you can speak English? How do you connect linguistically?
It's like an alien sci-fi series that everybody speaks English. You'd be surprised. I studied Arabic in school. This was after the peace with Egypt. My daughter, who's in high school today, and my son also study Arabic. I discovered later on, when I went to visit in Egypt, that most of the people there didn't understand it, because it's only then I found out that there's the literal literacy Arabic and there's the spoken Arabic. We are taught the literacy Arabic, which most of the people there don't understand. There's some nuances that are very different. I also understood that they're very different dialects. In Egypt, they understood me because that my teacher for Arabic was Egyptian. So I had the Egyptian accent and dialect. When I was later on in Jordan, they didn't understand me there. Again, the little Arabic, and I speak little Arabic.
But what about within the area of Israel and Palestine?
Israel,
which language
Hebrew,
connects all of you?
As I said, I had Arabs, Palestinians who worked with me in the Prime Minister's office. They spoke Hebrew. Their children and my children, I'm very happy to say, are very close friends. They spoke English between them because their children went to Arabic speaking schools. Mine go to Hebrew speaking schools. So they spoke English between them. And they sat with their phones, sitting and playing games on the phones. The great equalizer is technology today that brings children together. And
That's true.
Interestingly enough, my kids on social media are in touch with Arab kids throughout the Middle East, including children in the Palestinian areas. So us old people are still involved in and engaged in the old conflicts. The younger generation, maybe they're smarter than we are. They're finding ways and bridges that bring them together. We can all just hope that this is what the future entails for us.
Okay, so please clarify me if I'm wrong. Are you one of the rich class people over there? Are you from a privileged class over there?
I wish. No, I'm not. I was a civil servant for many years. Okay. And I say an honest civil servant who did not use my relations. Maybe I wasn't smart. Use my contacts and relations to benefit myself financially. I live in a very simple and pleasant, I would say we're middle class, my family.